सर आपकी आवाज़ नहीं आ रही।
We'll start at 35, giving people time to sign in. Right, geez, so it's 35, so I guess we should start now. Yes, Assalamu alaikum. Today we'll be discussing, we'll be continuing our discussion on the ASAD model. And in today's session, we'll try to cover everything that's included in the slides. And before we go into the slides, we want to talk about how this model works when it comes to explaining something about the economy in reference to price levels, GDP, and unemployment. Till this point, we haven't discussed shocks. So we'll start off by discussing what shocks are. Eventually, by the end of the session, you should be able to use the ASAD model, this particular model, to explain what happens to the economy whenever something happens in the world that affects an economy and causes your economy to move away from its equilibrium. So let's just start off by talking about what shocks are. And before we go to shocks, I want to uh, explain what endogenous variables are and what exogenous variables are. So in economics, there are basically there are many different types of variables, but two types of variables that you should at least know for this particular model is that there are two variables. One of them is called an endogenous variable and the exogenous variable. So you have endogenous variables versus exogenous variables. So endogenous variables are those variables that are part of the model, that are explaining something about the model. Are variables that are inside the model, and I'll just in a minute explain to you what I mean by inside the model and what I mean by endogenous is variables are those variables that are inside the model, and exogenous variables are those variables that are outside the model. Now, what does inside and outside basically mean? So, in order to figure out what inside and outside means, we'll be referring to our um, microeconomics demand supply model, which was just price and quantity, and then you had a demand for something, and then there was a supply curve for that particular product. In this model of demand and supply, recall that when you were coming up with a demand curve, you were assuming a lot of things constant. So, for example, in deriving this particular demand curve, you said we derive the demand curve using the demand law, which says that when prices are higher, quantity demanded is low. Assuming everything else constant. and this everything else that you were assuming to be constant was basically your income level. It was the level of your wealth, your preferences for this or taste for this particular thing for which you come up with a demand curve, and it was also prices of alternatives and stuff like that, the various factors that you'd assume to be constant, right? And then assuming that those were constant, you came up with the demand curve, which was a downward sloping curve according to the demand law. And similarly, you use the same logic to come up with the supply curve. In this demand and supply model, the two variables that are part of the model, they are inside the model or they are endogenous variables, are price levels and quantity demanded and quantity supplied. These two variables are endogenous variables. These variables can change. And we want to figure out the value of these variables that are inside the model. So we want to figure out the behavior of the endogenous variables, the ones that are inside the model, by assuming some variables which are outside the model but affect this model as constant. So you assume that income was constant, but if income were to change, the demand curve would shift. So income is an exogenous variable that affects, it's a variable that's outside or not in this picture, but affects this picture from outside. That's why income is called an exogenous variable. It's a exogenous variable for this particular model. Exogenous is like exit. You can remember it from exit. And endogenous, you can remember from enter, maybe. So it's inside the model. Exogenous variables are those models that affect the variables that affect the model, but we're assuming them to be constant when we come up with this demand and supply model. But changes in the value of the exogenous variables will eventually affect the model. So two variables. One of them is called an endogenous variable. Endogenous variables are all those variables you can see in the model. You can see price in the model. You can see quantity in the model. These two variables are the variables of your interest. You want to know what happens to quantity demanded or quantity supplied when price levels change. So these are endogenous variables. The variables that you assume constant and have an effect on the demand and supply model are called exogenous variables in the case of the demand and supply model. So there are two kinds of variables, endogenous variables and exogenous variables. Endogenous variables are variables that you can see in the model that are being estimated, for example. Exogenous variables are variables that are assumed constant and are outside the model. In the model, the value of price and quantity will be calculated, which is the endogenous variable, which are the endogenous variables. Exogenous variables, value of income and taste and preferences are assumed constant and then put in the model. You are not calculating the value of the exogenous variables. But changes in the exogenous variable will affect the price and quantity of whatever this is, जिस भी चीज की ये demand supply है. So अब होता ये है कि इकोनॉमी रन कर रही होती है, some exogenous changes to the economy that or changes in values of exogenous variables in the economy that impact the economy, right? So if you understand what exogenous means, exogenous is an external factor. It's not an internal factor. So coming back to our ASAD model, the ASAD model is basically a model that's trying to study what happens to the economy. Right now, in this particular model, endogenous price levels, general price levels. Your GDPs, you want to figure out what happens to the price levels, you want to figure out what happens to the GDP, you want to figure out what happens to unemployment. These are all endogenous variables. But these curves have been derived by assuming that a lot of things like there is a certain amount of money in circulation. That's how you came up with the aggregate demand curve. There is certain price level that's prevailing in the economy. That's how you came up with this P bar over here. There are a certain set of factors of production available in the economy. That is how you came up with the fat kg. An economy can produce a certain maximum amount of goods and services when it's running at full potential. That's how you came up with this Y bar and the long run aggregate supply curve. If something happens that affects one of these external variables, something happens, some event happens in the world that impacts the money that people have, or the price of things in the economy, or the factors of production available in the economy, this is called an exogenous, meaning coming from outside, shock to the economy. And what happens is when this exogenous shock hits the economy, it moves your economy away from this equilibrium point A. At equilibrium point A, you have a short run and long run equilibrium. The economy is stable. Price levels are P bar, GDP bar, unemployment is at its natural rate of UN, which is assumed to be 4%. Whenever a shock happens, it causes the economy to move away from this equilibrium. It causes the economy to move from the original equilibrium, and it makes the economy move away from this equilibrium level of output. And we've discussed probably a couple of examples over here. One of them was when there is a stock market crash, which is an external factor that affects this particular model. It affects the economy. There are many reasons for stock market crashes, and these are all external to this model because the only things internal to the model is price levels, GDP, and unemployment. So if something causes the stock market to crash, what happens is one of these external factors of production, price levels, or the money that people have in their pocket gets changed. In the case of stock market specifically, people lose their money. When people lose and companies lose their money, aggregate demand in the economy starts to decrease. This is an external shock that's happened to the economy, and it has caused the economy to move from point A, this equilibrium, to another equilibrium. And equilibriums are places where your demand equals supply. And since this model has two supplies, that means there must be two equilibriums. One of them is going to be where the short run supply cuts the demand, and the other one is going to be where the long run supply cuts the demand. So over here, this short run supply, the blue one, is cutting the red demand curve. So you have at point B, you have a short run equilibrium because demand is cutting the short run supply. Whereas when this demand curve cuts the long run equilibrium, which is the vertical line over here, there is another equilibrium which is called the long run equilibrium. I'll be calling it L. So whenever an exogenous event happens and it's a shock, it moves away from point A and then it moves the economy to the short run equilibrium. So the the economy starts moving towards point B over here in the graph. So what happens at point B is, at point B, you need to read the graph. At point B, price levels are, this point B is the short run equilibrium. So point B is the short run equilibrium. So what's happening at point B? Initially, GDP was Y bar, but now the economy is moved from A to B. And when it moves from A to B, at point B over here, the GDP must be lower. So I'll just call it 0. The GDP has fallen from Y bar to Y0, so GDP has gone down. When the economy moves from point A to point B in the short run, which is the short run equilibrium, because short run supply is being cut by the demand curve. At this point, A के ऊपर your GDP was Y bar, price levels were P bar, and unemployment was 4%. Now at point B, GDP has fallen. But at point B over here, price levels are still P bar. So price levels, but there is no change. So there is no change in price levels. Price levels are the same. However, when GDP falls, what happens to the unemployment? Unemployment starts to rise because production in the economy has gone down. You're producing less stuff in the economy. This means that unemployment would rise. Let's suppose it rises to 5%. So unemployment in the short run would increase. So what has happened is when a shock happened, an external exogenous shock happened, it moved the economy away from point A where it was producing Y bar. It moved the economy to a position or GDP level of Y0, which was less than the original value. And when it moved the economy away from the equilibrium Y bar to Y0, GDP fell, it caused unemployment to increase. And when unemployment increased, what happened to price levels? In the short run at point B, nothing happened to price levels. Price levels at A were P bar, if you read the graph. At point A, if you read the graph, price levels were P bar. At point B over here, point B over here, price levels are still, if you read the graph over here, it's still P bar. However, GDP has fallen. When GDP falls, unemployment increases. I have just shown how it assumed that it increased from 4% to 5%. What happens in the long run is that the economy starts moving from the short run equilibrium, which is point B. This is where the short run supply is cutting the aggregate demand. In the long run, prices start to change because we assume that in the short run prices were sticky, but in the long run, the difference between in the short run and the long run is that prices start to become they're no longer sticky. When prices are no longer sticky, what starts to happen is the economy starts moving towards the long run equilibrium. So you start moving from point A to point L in the long run. So the economy starts moving from point B, it starts moving towards point L. What's happening in the at point L in the long run? What happens? In the long run, what happens is GDP starts increasing from Y0 and increases to Y bar. So in the long run, GDP has increased again. It's back to its natural rate of output, natural output, Y bar. That's the maximum they could have produced. And when production increases, unemployment decreases because now people are being employed to increase the production. Over here at Y bar, unemployment has decreased again to 4%. People have gotten their jobs back again. However, at point L, what has happened is that price levels are now not P bar, they are P1 or P0. Price levels have fallen from P bar to P0. So things in the long run have become cheaper, prices have gone down. So this model, the ASAD model, is used to understand what would happen to the economy when the economy is hit by a shock. And then you need to figure out that once an economy is hit by a shock, how do we fix the problem that's happened to the economy? And fixing the problem is called the stabilization policy. How do we stabilize the economy? How do we fix the fact that GDP has fallen and unemployment has gone down? What we need to remember is that this seems like a very interesting case where if you face such a shock, in the long run prices would fall. And that is something maybe you want. But the problem is that once the shock happens in the economy moves from point A to point B, the government is not sure or the central bank does not know exactly how long it's going to take the economy to move from point B to point L, it might take 1 year, it might take 10 years. And during this time, when the economy moves from point B to point L, a lot of people are unemployed. And when they're unemployed and don't have jobs, there is a lot of unrest in the society. So the government or the state bank has to somehow respond and fix the problem as soon as possible. For the time being, what I want you to just understand is that whenever an external shock happens to the economy, it moves the economy away from its original equilibrium of A. It moves the economy away from A. It could be B or it could be someplace else. But it moves the economy away from its original equilibrium. Now, there are many types of shocks. Since we just discussed what shocks are exogenous changes. Exogenous changes in exogenous variables that impact the economy. Now, these shocks can either be positive shocks or they can be negative shocks, which means something good might even happen. It's not necessary that always bad things would happen to the economy. Something good could also happen to the economy. Right? So, shocks can either be positive or they can be negative. And since our model over here, this ASAT model, aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, has two things in it. One is supply and the other is demand. You can have a shock that impacts demand and a shock that impacts supply. So there are two curves that can be impacted, the demand curve or the supply curve. And these shocks can either there can either be a positive demand shock or a negative demand shock, or similarly you can have a positive supply shock and a negative supply shock, so you can have both. So I'll just make a graph of what a positive demand shock looks like and what a negative demand shock looks like. You need to be able to make this diagram, the one that I'm just making over here, for the exam. Even without reading the question, if it's an ASAT related question that comes in the exam, you need to make this first. You need to show that the economy is at equilibrium point A. At equilibrium point A, the price levels that are assumed to be constant at, let's say, 100. They're going to be running at full potential, which is Y bar. And employment is at its natural rate, let's call it 4%. Right? So now we're discussing shocks. And now what we've said is that shocks can impact either the demand or the supply. And when it comes to demand, there can be a positive demand shock and a negative demand shock. So a negative demand shock we've discussed. When the stock market crashes, aggregate demand falls. And when aggregate demand falls, what happens is at the new equilibrium, the short run equilibrium point B, GDP falls to a smaller value. The GDP falling is a bad thing. Production of the country has gone down. So that's why whenever aggregate demand decreases because of a shock, it's called a negative demand shock. If something happens to the economy that causes your aggregate demand to increase, let's suppose Amazon decides to start operations in Pakistan. Why do you think that would cause the aggregate demand to move forward?
सर एक्सपेंशन हो रही है ना बिजनेस की, तो डिमांड बढ़ जाएगी प्रोडक्ट क्योंकि बढ़ रहे होंगे.
अच्छा, ये जो एग्रीगेट डिमांड की हमने डिस्कशन, राइट, यू राइट, एग्रीगेट डिमांड की डिस्कशन की थी ना, हमने कहा था यार एग्रीगेट डिमांड तब मूव होता है जब अमाउंट ऑफ मनी इन पीपल्स पॉकेट चेंजेस, बट इट आल्सो चेंजेस बिकॉज पैसों को इस्तेमाल करके लोगों ने चीजें खरीदनी होती है, राइट. This aggregate demand also changes when people start buying more things. अगर मेरे पास 1000 रुपए and I buy only use 500 rupees out of my 1000 rupees that I have, it will create a certain demand. But if I start using all of my 1000 rupees, it should also cause the total demand for things in the economy to increase. So recall जब हमने aggregate demand derive की थी ना, तो we came up with something called the theory of quantity of money, which looked like MV is equal to PY. तो मनी सप्लाई बढ़ने की वजह से हमने कहा था कि जी since velocity is normally constant and production भी किसी लेवल की इकोनॉमी की कांस्टेंट ही होती है, तो if money supply goes up, price level should go up. But what this was in another interpretation for this equation is that if money supply goes up, your nominal GDP will increase. Similarly, for nominal GDP, which is this right hand side, for this to increase, if number of transactions happening in the economy increase, it will also cause the GDP to increase. So in the case of this Amazon coming to Pakistan, what happens is people who in the coronavirus scenario were not going to the markets to buy things from the market, now they have an option to buy stuff online from Amazon. So number of transactions happening in the economy starts to increase. Since more transactions are now, people are able to buy things from Amazon now rather than having to go through all the hassle of going to the markets, aggregate demand increases. Amazon coming to the Pakistani market is a positive demand shock. It is increasing the demand in the economy. And when this happens, and I'm saying that this is a positive demand shock, what happens is that the economy moves to a new equilibrium. हमने कहा था मॉडल के अंदर you have two kinds of equilibriums. One of them is called the short run equilibrium. Short run equilibrium is where the aggregate demand curve cuts the short run supply, which means that point B over here is the short run supply equilibrium. And the long run equilibrium को मैं L label कर रहा हूँ is the point where the long run aggregate supply cuts the new aggregate demand. So that point is over here. So when there is a positive demand shock, something positive happens which creates extra demand in the economy. What happens is the economy starts to move from point A to point B. Economy starts moving from point A to point B. Point A पे क्या चल रहा था? Point A पे price levels 100 थी, GDP Y bar था, unemployment was 4%. But after the demand shock, what starts to happen is the economy starts to move towards point B, and at point B now the GDP has increased from Y bar to a higher level, Y1, and at Y1, since more things are being produced, that means that people would be required to work to produce more things. So basically unemployment in the economy would decrease. So unemployment would become. So when the economy moves from point A to point B, GDP increases to Y1. पहले Y bar था. It increases to Y1. Unemployment, which was 4% earlier, decreases because now in order to produce more, you would require more people to work for you. However, at point B, price levels are still 100. If you read B over here on the graph, it's still 100. So A or B के ऊपर price levels change नहीं हो रहे. So what happens when there is a positive demand shock is that in the short run, GDP increases. So GDP बढ़ के Y bar से Y1 पे हो गया. And your unemployment rates decrease. बेरोजगारी in the economy decreases. More people get jobs because you're producing more now. Prices are still constant. Prices को कोई change नहीं आता. There is no change in. They don't go up or down. They're still at a price level of 100. However, after 2 months, after 6 months, after a year, after 2 years, the economy starts to move to the long run equilibrium because prices are no longer sticky. So the economy starts moving from point B and it starts moving towards the long run equilibrium L. So the economy starts moving from point B to point L. Now what's happening at point L? So at point L, in the long run, what's happening is that GDP is now, if you go down over here, it's Y bar again. GDP is Y bar again. So in the long run, GDP has fallen. And when GDP falls, you need less people to work for you. So unemployment increases again and it's back to its natural rate. What happens to prices over here at point L? At point L, the price level is now, say, 200. So in the long run, prices increase. Right? So a positive demand shock in the short run causes GDP to increase, causes unemployment to decrease, and there is no change on price levels. However, in the long run, what happens is that this shock is no more there. When it's not there, prices start to increase, GDP falls back to its original level over here at Y bar, and unemployment is back at its natural rate. Now, the question that you should be asking is, and if you're not asking it, you should be asking this is, okay, when we were discussing this Y bar, we said that this Y bar was the maximum an economy could produce. This was the maximum that your class, if it was an economy, could produce using the limited resources, land, labor, capital, technology that you have. How is the economy able to produce more than Y bar? How is it producing Y? That is something that you should have been asking yourself. How did the economy cross its maximum potential? So one way to explain how the economy crosses this maximum potential is that you can think of it as asking your employees to work overtime. You normally work 8 hours a day, which is the normal time. You start telling people that we'll be paying you more. So why don't you work a little extra for us? And when people start putting in that extra time, the production of the economy starts crossing the maximum that they produce. So they start working beyond their normal. And what they do is they end up increasing GDP from Y bar to Y1. Now what's happening is you guys are working overtime. But the problem is that there is a limit to how long you can work overtime. There will be a time that will that will happen where you'll get tired and you say, okay, we've had enough of working overtime. This is too much for us. We can't be working 16 hours a day. So we want to go back to our normal 8 hours. Thank you very much. We don't want the extra pay. So the economy in the short run, you can achieve this higher level, but this higher level is not sustainable. And since it's not sustainable, the GDP will have to fall again to Y bar again in the long run. Short run, you can work these extra hours, but in the long run, it is not sustainable. Since it's not sustainable, what happens is GDP falls. And when GDP falls, the consequence of GDP falling is that prices start to increase, and they increase from that 100 level to 200. Now prices are permanently higher. And normally you experience this positive aggregate demand shocks happening during the last few years of governments. So since, for example, in this case, PTS tenure of 5 years is starting to end, in the last year, you will see a lot of work being done. The central bank will be increasing the amount of money in the economy. When the amount of money in the economy starts increasing, a lot of projects will be initiated by the government. There is another side, fiscal side of increasing aggregate demand as well, but we're not going to be going into that because for certain reasons, we don't want to go there. But normally in the last years, governments try to increase GDP from Y bar to Y1. The idea is that when you increase GDP from Y bar to Y1, people get jobs. And when people get jobs, they might end up voting for you for the next tenure. They might end up voting you in for the next tenure. But the problem with doing such a thing to the economy is, okay, when you manipulate the economy and increase the aggregate demand forward, in the short run, price levels remain the same. You are able to achieve a higher GDP with more jobs are given to people. But in the long run, what happens is that GDP falls again to its original value. Unemployment is back to its original value. However, now prices are higher. इसको economics में in economics we call this overheating the economy. It's called overheating the economy. Making the economy work beyond its potential. When you make the economy work beyond its potential, you're able to increase production. But this increase in production is not sustainable. Since it's not sustainable, what happens in the long run is that you get penalized in the form of inflation happening in the economy, price levels increasing, महंगाई हो जाती है. Anyhow, right now what we've discussed is something called a positive demand shock. So you have, ma'am.
Sir, what if we use advanced new latest technology instead of overtime? उससे तो कोई या फिर उससे भी eventually GDP कम हो जाएगा.
So recall that when we were talking about technologies, इस पूरे मॉडल में टेक्नोलॉजी कहाँ पे आ रही थी? So technology was part of your factors of production. You land, labor, capital, or A. A is technology. So when technology changes, what happens is your aggregate demand doesn't change. Your long run aggregate supply moves forward. That would be the ideal thing to do. But the problem is changing technology is not easy. It's not in our hands. We wish कि हमारी technology बहुत improve हो जाती, but increasing technology is not possible. It's a difficult thing. It's not in control of the central bank, nor is it in control of the government, at least in the short run. In the long run, you would want to start educating people more. They would come and do more R&D over here, and then ultimately technology would start growing. But technology growth एकदम आप खुद से नहीं बढ़ा सकते. There is a limit to what your technology is at the moment. That is what you're using to make this maximum amount of viable. But अगर आपकी technology improve हो जाती है, you get some technology from Korea or China, then automatically not your aggregate demand, but your long run aggregate supply curve will move. You will be producing more higher amount of GDP, and that is going to be a sustainable level of GDP. So if technology changes, your long run aggregate supply curve will shift. So this.
Thank you, sir. Sir, another thing, what if we decrease tax rate? That can also be example of positive demand shock, right? Because purchasing power लोगों की बढ़ जाएगी.
Right. That is a very good point. However, अभी हम ये बात करें, we are talking about shocks. Shocks are basically, ये जो मैंने आपको overheating की बात की ना, तो I'm just saying कि this is what the government does, and उसकी consequence क्या होती है? This chapter that we're talking over here is about exogenous shocks rather than the government and the central bank trying to increase aggregate demand or decrease it.
Okay, ठीक है. Thank you.
So changes in tax would be something good, maybe. I'm not sure.
But it's by government.
It's by the government. It's not a shock for the government. It is something predictable. Right. Now that we've talked about two kinds of shocks, one of them is called a positive demand shock, and the second one is called a negative demand shock. We want to talk about supply. Yes.
So if there is a positive shock and the demand increases, so is outsourcing a viable source, like in order to meet the short-term aggregate demand?
That is possible. You can outsource. But अभी हम since modeling की बात करें ना, in the real world you obviously outsource. But since we are talking about modeling at the moment, तो हम basically assume ये कह रहे हैं कि यार it's more of a closed economy. That's why we are restricting our long run aggregate supply curve at a certain maximum level. वरना तो because of globalization आपकी जो है ना ये y bar is not really restricted. There is no limit. You start outsourcing it. You use the factors of production में जो entrepreneur की power है उसको हम डालते ही नहीं है यहाँ पे. You can start outsourcing it. आपकी resources बढ़ती जाती हैं, availability labor भी बढ़ना शुरू हो जाएगी. What happens because of outsourcing is कि labor starts to increase, right? जब labor बढ़ना शुरू होगी तो long run aggregate supply आगे जाना शुरू हो जाएगी.
Alright.
तो ये जो बड़ी-बड़ी economies है ना, अपना ये outsource करके labor को बढ़ाती हैं अपने, which causes their long run aggregate supply curve to move forward. Because वैसे internally within a country in a particular model, in this case there is a resource की constraint, that is economics. यार आपकी resources limited है, you want to optimize or maximize your satisfaction given the limited resources, and you need to figure out how to do that. That's economics. अच्छा, so the shocks, back to the shocks जी. So we've talked about demand shocks, और हमने अभी तक ये कहा है कि to simplify stuff, anything that causes aggregate demand to decrease is called a negative demand shock. Anything that causes the aggregate demand to increase is called a positive demand shock. Right? Similarly, जो supply curves है ना, supply curves can also experience shocks. And supply curves की जो shocks है ना, you can have a long run technology का shock. And in case of technology का shock, one example could be कि यार iPhones जो हैं, they come up with a new chip and everybody starts using it over here, और उसको इस्तेमाल करके हमारी शायद कुछ productivity बढ़ जाए in our factories and whatever work we are doing, that can cause our Y bar to increase, and then it can move your long run aggregate supply forward. When your long run aggregate supply curve moves forward, it's called a positive demand shock. However, in this chapter you will find कि long run aggregate supply को हम के shocks को हम discuss ही नहीं करते. The reason is that if you that this particular model or chapter is regarding business cycles rather than the economy as a whole. And initially we said that business cycles were basically changes that were happening in the economy. These shocks that were happening in the economy were causing the GDP to sometimes increase, sometimes decrease, sometimes increase, sometimes decrease. So we were trying to figure out what happens or how the economy behaves normally in the short run. So shocks were basically dealing with when an event happens that causes the short run curves to shift. Although aggregate demand is not a short run curve, but this model or business cycles are basically focused on the short run rather than the long run. That's why when we talk about shocks on the supply side, we'll be discussing only shocks for the short run aggregate supply. So in case of negative and positives, so let me just make this diagram a little clearer. Let me just put some values over here, and then I'll ask you a question about shocks. Acha ji. So something happens to the economy that causes the short run aggregate supply to curve to move up. Question: is this a negative shock or a positive shock?
Sir, negative.
Right. ये याद रखना है कि जब when the curve goes up, it feels as if it's a positive thing. It's a good thing that's happening in the economy. However, things are becoming more expensive. Price बढ़ रही है. And since prices are increasing, this is called a negative supply shock. So it's a negative supply shock that happens in the economy. Similarly, if this curve goes down, things are becoming cheaper. And if they're becoming cheaper, that's a good thing for the economy. And it's called a positive demand shock. Similarly, this negative and positive effect you can see over here. यहाँ पे GDP at this point B over here, GDP has fallen. That's why it's called a negative demand shock. In this point C over here, GDP has increased. That's why it's called a positive supply shock. So you can use either of the logics to remember that a negative supply shock happens when the supply curve moves up. It's a positive supply shock if the supply curve, short-run aggregate supply, moves down. Achha, before I go on to discuss what causes or examples of this thing happening in the world, एक चीज जो यहाँ पे आपने थोड़ा सा नोट करनी है, something that you haven't probably noticed over here, is that whenever something like this happens in the economy, whenever there is a negative demand shock in the economy and aggregate demand falls, this was the case where the stock market crashes. So in the short run, what's happening is the GDP is falling and people are losing their jobs. When the GDP falls from economy moves from point A to point B, GDP falls, people lose their jobs. The price levels, however, remain constant. So I lost my job because of this shock, but at least things were at a certain price level. Price level was the same in the short run. In the long run, things became cheaper, right? Similarly, in the long run, so when there is a negative demand shock, people lose their jobs, but price levels are constant. These supply shocks are also called price shocks. The supply shocks are also called price shocks. So any kind of event that causes the cost of production to change for producers and ultimately causes the price of the thing that these producers are selling in the economy to change is called a supply shock. It can be a positive supply shock, it can be a negative supply shock. The most common example of a supply shock is a shock that is related with the price of oil in the world. So this is your model. You have price levels this, and and you're at equilibrium point A, and GDP is Y bar. So let's suppose, so this is going to be important. Let's suppose that I wonder if you know about this organization called the OPEC. Any clue as to what this OPEC is?
Organization of oil producing, oil exporting countries.
Right. So this organization of countries that produce and export oil is composed of countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, then you have Iraq, you have America, you have Iran. There are these big countries that actually export oil to the rest of the world, right? Or here is the thing about oil prices. Oil is used in everything that we do in an economy. As a producer, I should understand that हमारी जो बिजली आती है, our electricity is based on oil. If prices of oil goes up, मेरी जो फैक्ट्री के अंदर मशीनें रखी, जो बिजली का खर्चा आ रहा है ना, बिजली का खर्चा आ रहा है, बिजली का खर्चा goes up. As a farmer, my tube well, अभी तो शायद सोलर पे आना शुरू हो गए हैं, but most of our tube wells are based on oil. डीजल पे चलते हैं, डीजल पे, पेट्रोल पे या बिजली पे. So whenever oil की price goes up or down, it indirectly affects everything, the price of everything in the economy. right? And ये जो OPEC है ना, ये basically you can think of the OPEC as an oligopoly. And an oligopoly was something that we covered in microeconomics. Basically 7-8 जो है ना firms होती हैं जो मिलके they are determining the price of things in the economy, because they are supplying the oil. There is a demand for oil, and this is the supply of oil, and this supply of oil, price and quantity over here, is controlled by these guys sitting in OPEC. OPEC की जो है ना ये हर महीने मीटिंग करते हैं, and they decide on how much to supply in the world की market. And if they decide to decrease supply in the economy, in the world oil, what do you think should happen to the price of oil? If these countries sit down together and say कि यार Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or the United States decide in this OPEC meeting कि we've decided to cut our supplies, तो सारे अपनी supply को cut करेंगे, curtail करेंगे, तो what happens is the supply curve of oil moves back. You have
Negative.
S1. So when this supply curve, please don't mix it with the ASAD model at the moment. What happens is the price of oil starts to go up. New price is P1. Quantity supplied in the market has gone down. So these countries who are part of the members of this OPEC, control the price of oil by controlling the supply of oil. अगर price कम करनी है तो they start supplying more into the market. When they supply more into the market, prices fall. If they want to increase price, what they do is they start restricting or controlling the amount of oil that they're supplying to the world. And by controlling this price of oil, supply of oil, they control the price. So अगर OPEC decide करती है कि हम अपनी supply of oil रोक रहे हैं, what do you think should happen to this economy of Pakistan? When OPEC decides कि हम अपनी oil को be restricting oil production supply to the world, this basically means that the price of oil will start going up. When the price of oil starts going up, you need to understand this one thing, that this supply curve is not related with, this is not the supply of oil. This is supply of everything that is happening in the that is being produced in the economy. This is a short-run supply of everything that's produced in the economy. And when price of oil, which is this red thing, this red highlighted area over here, when the price of oil goes up, the price of everything in the economy starts to go up. And when the price of everything starts to go up, so your price levels and start to go up. When price levels start to go up, this short-run aggregate supply moves up, because now everything in the economy starts to become more expensive. And now everything is a little more expensive now. It's at P1. Understand this one thing here. Okay, this curve moving upwards does not mean that the prices have become flexible. वो जो रेस्टोरेंट था उसने अपनी प्राइस impact है, everything in the economy has changed, has become more expensive. The price levels are now were earlier stuck at P bar, now they are stuck at P1. Stuck का basic मतलब ये है कि if you were to supply, if the supplier was to supply one good in the economy, he would charge a price of P1. If he were to supply 100 goods in the market, he would still charge the price of P1. So this is where prices are stuck. Quantity or price का relationship आपस में नहीं है. That's why what we mean by when we say कि in the short run prices are stuck. Otherwise, if they were not stuck, increasing the quantity or the supply of in the economy will happen. prices increase. Recall the supply law. The supply law said, okay, if the price of a commodity goes up, only then will the seller be willing to supply a higher value. In this case, at a very small quantity, the price is P1. At a very large quantity, the price is still P1. So that is where prices are stuck. So back to this. Oil prices in the world increase, which causes which causes the price of everything in the economy to increase, and your short-run aggregate supply curve shifts upwards. This is a negative supply shock. Everything has become more expensive. Now my question to you guys is, okay, what is point B and what is point C? This was A. Hanji, equilibriums. Where are the equilibriums? Where is the short run equilibrium and where is the long run equilibrium in this case? Recall, equilibrium is where demand and supply curves cut.
Sir, C point is the short run equilibrium, or
So this is
A
the
is
short run.
the long.
And what is B?
B is just an intersection of the long run and the short run supply curve. It's not an
Right.
equilibrium.
B is nothing. So B is basically the supply and supply cutting. जब भी supply और supply cut करती है, तो that doesn't mean anything. Only when the supply and the demand cut is where you come up with an equilibrium. At point C, your short run supply is cutting the demand curve. You have an equilibrium over here. At point A, your long run aggregate supply is cutting the aggregate demand. So at point A, you have the long run equilibrium over here as well. Okay, so A is also the long run equilibrium. So whenever there is a supply shock that happens in the economy, we say that supply shocks are the worst kind of shocks that can happen to an economy. So petrol prices increasing internationally is the worst possible shock that can happen to an economy. The question is, why is that the case? If you notice, when the short-run aggregate supply curve moves from the black one to the red one, what this is saying is the economy starts moving from point A, it starts moving to the short-run equilibrium, which is point C. So economy starts moving, and it starts moving towards point C. And when it gets to point C, what's happening? In the short run, what's happening? In the short run, your GDP falls from Y bar, goes down to Y0. So your GDP has gone down in the short run. So when the economy moves from point A to point C, GDP falls. Because at point C, if you read the graph, you have Y naught over here, and price levels have gone up. So GDP falls. Recall that whenever GDP falls, what happens to unemployment? It increases. Because you're producing less. When you're producing less, you need fewer people. When you need fewer people, the people who are working at factories get fired. They get unemployed. Unemployment in the economy starts to go up. And what happens to price is, you notice that price levels were initially P bar, but now at this point C over here, price levels are P1. So over here, price levels have also increased. So what has happened here is, I lost my, so GDP fell, and when GDP was falling, I lost my job. And when I lost my job, to top it all up, things started to become more expensive as well. Earlier, when we were discussing a negative demand shock, what happened was, sure, GDP fell and I lost my job, unemployment increased, but at least the prices were constant. At least the prices were still P bar. In this case, in the case of a negative supply shock, what happens is GDP falls, you lose your job, but prices start increasing as well. That's why it's called the worst possible kind of shock that can happen for an economy. And there is a special name given to this shock. What is happening is, let me just erase this. What's happening is that the economy is stagnating. Stagnating is slowing down. The economy is and is falling, the economy is, inflation is also happening. So that's why this case of a negative supply shock is called stagflation. Stagnant with inflation. So GDP is decreasing and price levels are increasing. So your GDP falls and price levels increase whenever there is a negative supply shock. And negative supply shocks की एक example होगी है this OPEC की decision to curtail supply of oil in the market. Sorry. Acha, so do you guys have any idea regarding the fact that the US has placed an embargo on Iran? Do you have an understanding about what embargoes are? Or do you know this term called sanction? So America places a sanction on Pakistan.
It's basically like limiting the exports.
Right. So it's basically limiting any kind of trade with a particular country. At the moment, America is forcing a sanction or is placing a trade embargo on Iran. So Iran ke upar, they're not being allowed to sell their oil in the world market. Right? This is what happened when this happened basically when Trump got elected. And before Trump, what was happening was the previous government had a deal, nuclear proliferation ke upar deal thi, which in which Iran said that we won't be using our nuclear program to make these atomic bombs. So America under Obama agreed that will allow you to sell your oil to the world, right? So when Trump got elected, तो उसने आके कहा कि जी नहीं, I don't agree with this deal, and I think Iran secretly जो है ना अपनी uranium को enrich कर रहा है to make these atom bombs. उन्होंने अपना ये atomic program बंद नहीं किया हुआ. So he actually cancelled that deal and put an embargo on Iran. When he put an embargo on Iran, तो supply जो Iran कर रहा था ना economy world को oil, वो obviously restrict होगी. So the amount of oil being exported to, or supplied to the world decreased, and when it decreased, when supply decreases, it causes prices to go up. That's when this kind of negative supply shock happened. And let's just suppose Joe Biden wins today and he agrees to reenact that last agreement that they had, or Iran is allowed to actually sell its oil to the rest of the world. What do you think would happen in terms of oil prices? Oil की price को क्या होगा if Iran is allowed to sell its oil to the world?
Decrease हो जाएगी.
Oil की prices decrease होना शुरू हो जाएंगी. और अगर oil की prices decrease होना शुरू हो जाएंगी, then we'll be buying cheap oil, and the electricity that we'll be producing is going to be cheaper. And all the transportation cost of all the food that's coming from all the rural areas वो कम हो जाएगी. This would mean that fruits in the markets are going to become cheaper as well. Overall, everything in the economy is going to become cheaper. When everything in the economy will start to become cheaper, what will happen is your short run aggregate supply curve will move downward, because now everything is cheaper. So you were originally at point A. अमेरिका ने अलाउ कर दिया ईरान को ऑयल एक्सपोर्ट करना. People are now buying oil from Iran. What starts to happen is your short run aggregate supply moves down, and there is a new equilibrium now, point B. This point B is the short run equilibrium. Point A is still the long run equilibrium. Economy starts moving from A to point B. Point B पे क्या हो रहा है? In the short run, what's happening? In the short run, your GDP is increasing. Since GDP is increasing, unemployment will go down. And what's happening to price levels? Price levels, जो P bar पे थे, are now at P1. They have gone down. Prices have gone down as well. So GDP has improved. Price levels have gone down. And people are getting jobs as well. Before the coronavirus, the last quarter था ना, before the coronavirus, you must have noticed that the price of oil had started to go down. तेल सस्ता हो गया था. And the government transferred it to the people. Oil had become cheap, and which meant that things were starting to improve because prices were going down. But then the coronavirus happened. Anyway, we'll discuss what happens when the coronavirus happens later. But over here, what I'm saying is that when price of oil decreases in the world, global market, everything becomes cheaper because price levels in the short run, price levels go down. We experience this. Things were becoming cheaper. GDP भी improve होना शुरू हो जाता है. Things, you start producing more stuff. And people start getting jobs as well. In the last tenure of PMLN, they were experiencing this. They were experiencing a positive supply shock. Oil prices were decreasing in the world market, which is why you saw that your this PMLN government experienced growth rates that went up to 5%. Right? Prices were decreasing, people were getting jobs, and GDP was also increasing. So in the short run, the economy moves from point A to point B for 2 months, for 6 months, for 1 year, for 2 years. But then the economy starts moving back to point A. Because point A is basically the long run equilibrium as well. In the long run, what happens is prices you're back at point A again. Economy जो A से move करके B पे आई थी, it starts moving back to A, and at A GDP is back to Y bar, unemployment is back at your natural rate, and price levels are back at P bar. So this is the case of a positive supply shock. Now the thing is, whenever such shocks happen in the economy, and I want to discuss the case of this negative supply shock, which is the worst kind of shock that an economy can face. And this is where your supply curve increased to SRAS1, and economy moved from point A to point B, which is Y0, and unemployment has gone up. So this is the case of a supply shock. Supply shock आया, the prices बढ़ी, so it caused the GDP to decrease. Y bar से Y naught पे आ गया. It fell from Y bar to Y naught. And whenever GDP falls, what happens is unemployment starts to increase. And in this case, since this is stagflation, the prices also increased, and GDP had fallen. When this happens, I've lost my job, and things are becoming more expensive. Inflation is very high. मुल्क में agitation शुरू हो जाती है. In the short run, economy moves from point A and moves to B. What happens in the long run? It goes back to point A again. It goes back to point A again. Point A again में मुझे नौकरी फिर मिल जाएगी, and when I get the job, price levels are back to P bar, and GDP is back at Y bar. Now the problem with this is that the government or the central bank is not sure how long it's going to take the economy to move from point B to point A. So you're not sure about the time frame जिसे B से A पे वापस आना है in the long run वाली situation में. And what has happened is people have lost their jobs and prices are increasing. So this is really affecting the people. With the demand shock, तो हुआ ये था ना कि I lost my job, but at least prices were constant. Things were not becoming more expensive day by day. Whenever shocks happen into the economy, the central bank is there to as the firefighter over here. उसका काम ये होता है to resolve these shocks, to fix these shocks. Recall जब हमने शुरू में बात की थी ना about GDP, तो हमने कहा था जी economy basically, the economy is actually, So when we discussed this ASAD model initially, and we were just talking about business cycles, we said that the economy is fluctuating like this. And ideally, you want to reduce the size of these fluctuations down to very small, इसका scale reduce करना चाहते हैं. वैसे तो यहाँ पे भी आप 2%, 3% पे grow कर रहे हैं. You're growing at 3% over here and over here as well. But you want to reduce the size of these shocks. And it's the job of the State Bank of Pakistan to stabilize the economy by reducing the size of these shocks. और चक्कर ये है कि जैसे ही आपको स्टेट बैंक को पता लगता है ना कि यार there is a shock has happened and GDP has started falling. I'll use the black over here, and they find out that the GDP has started to falling. They need to take corrective action and एकदम अपनी ना GDP को अपने reverse करने की कोशिश करनी होती है उन्होंने, recover कराना होता है, and start to make it grow into growth again. But then there is another, they need to intervene and make sure कि एकदम recover कर जाए. They want to make sure that these shocks are not as big in scale as I've just shown you. I hope that this I'm able to get across what I'm trying to explain to you. The idea is to decrease the impact of the shocks. When this kind of negative shock happens, people are affected the most. So it's the job of this. Recall that monetary policy was something that was reviewed every month, whereas your fiscal policy, which was the year's policy in the budget, was done once in a year. So you can't actually go or look into the fiscal policy to help you with resolving shocks, because those fiscal policies, for those fiscal policies, you have to go to the parliament, you have to get laws approved, and it takes time. And such shocks need immediate action. They need to be resolved. Sometimes, even in the middle of the month, your committee will sit in order to resolve some kind of event that has happened. So in this case, the economy has moved from point A and come to point B. People have, I've lost my job. and things are becoming expensive. What should the central bank do? क्या ख्याल है जी? What should the central bank do? Recall, central bank, Chasana State Bank of Pakistan, could control the amount of money in circulation using the monetary policy. We talked about printing money, we talked about policy rate, we talked about open market operations, we talked about this one other factor, reserve ratios. हमने कहा था ये कि if they print money, the amount of money in circulation in the economy increases, and when the amount of money in circulation in the economy increases, aggregate demand increases. Similarly, whenever the State Bank of Pakistan sells bonds to people, when it buys bonds from people, it takes that piece of paper from the people and gives them money. The amount of money in circulation increases. With reserve ratios, when reserve ratios are decreased, banks keep less reserves with themselves, lend more money out to the people, money in supply increases. With the policy rate, when policy rate goes down, it's easier for people to take a loan from the bank. When they can take the loan from the bank, money in circulation increases. So in case of a negative supply shock economy moving from A to point B, the state bank comes into action and resolves or stabilizes the economy by using the monetary policy to increase the amount of money in circulation. It starts increasing the money supply in the economy. What happens when the money supply increases? It causes your aggregate demand to start moving forward. When your aggregate demand moves forward, by moving this aggregate demand forward, this is where the central bank is changing the demand. ये shock की वजह से नहीं हुआ हुआ. This is where the central bank is doing it itself. It's stabilizing the economy. What the central bank does is it moves the economy from point B to this new point over here, point S, which is, इसको X कर देते हैं, point X, which is the stabilized point. यहाँ पे हुआ ये कि although things are now at what's happening at point X. At point X over here, prices are high, fine. चीजें पहले P bar पे थी, because of the state bank increasing the money supply. What they've done is now at point X, prices are P1, are still P1. Prices कम नहीं कर सके वो. However, the GDP has now increased from Y naught to Y bar now. And when GDP increases, I just got my job back. So I got my job back. However, things have become more expensive now. And this is a permanent increase in price levels. Now price levels are not going to go down to P bar in the long run. They are going to stay at a higher level of P1. However, now I've got a job, so maybe I'm not feeling the crunch as much. So this action taken by the State Bank of Pakistan to stabilize the economy is called stabilization policies, a state bank.
Sir, is it the same situation we are facing right now?
The situation at the moment is a little more trickier in the sense that, sure, State Bank wants to stabilize the economy, and it's trying to increase aggregate demand. And yes, prices are increasing. But whether we are having a supply shock at the moment is debatable. So prices are, recently I saw that prices have started to decrease. Oil prices have started to decrease. I'm not sure. But of recent times, this is what was happening. Things were becoming more and more expensive. And maybe one reason for them becoming more expensive was the fact that oil prices जो गिरी हुई थी ना पहले, कोरोना से पहले, वो बढ़ना शुरू हो गई थी, which was a negative supply shock. And then to top it all up, your central bank was increasing money supply as well. और money supply increase करने के लिए उसने policy rate जिसका 13% था उसको लेके चला गया था to 7-8%. I think 7.5% पे दिख रहा है आजकल. But आजकल जो ना अभी I'm not sure whether supply shock continue कर रहा है या prices कम होना शुरू हो गई. So in that case I don't know whether this is the case, but this has been happening of late. अच्छा जी, so अब करते हैं कि since I have talked a lot over here about this thing, let's just go on to the slides and see what I've covered and what I've skipped, because I guess you'll be preparing for the exam using the slides. So this is I'll be skipping a lot of it. I'll be keeping it. I'll be going through it very quickly. You will have to read up on it on your own. कि slides पे क्या दिया हुआ है. पहले business cycles के facts दिए मैं थोड़े से. This slide over here talks about how normally in the long run GDPs or economies grow कर रही होती हैं. और then it talks about the fact कि जी investment जो है ना वो बहुत volatile है. जब भी हालात खराब होते हैं in a particular economy, when conditions get bad, the first thing that leaves the country is investment. And since GDP is basically composed of consumption, investment, and government spending and stuff, so whenever these things leave the economy, GDP gets affected. Then it talks about the fact that whenever GDP decreases for an economy, since the economy is producing less, unemployment starts to rise. And whenever the economy is producing more, there is an expansion in the size of the economy, unemployment starts to go down. And this relationship, this inverse relationship between GDP and unemployment, the fact that whenever the economy is producing more, unemployment starts to go down is depicted by this law called the Okun's law. And the Okun's law is shown in one of these slides आगे जाके using data, and proves the Okun's law by showing that unemployment or inflation का unemployment or GDP का जो है inverse relationship है. But don't focus on the Okun's law. You don't need to know about it at the moment, at least. There are a couple of graphs over here in this chapter as well. These graphs depict the real GDP growth of an economy. This is the American economy growing 3%. ये जो shaded areas हैं, these red bars or pink bars, whatever color this is, are depicting areas where real GDP growth rate has started to go down. And when real GDP growth goes down, you will find that consumption follows the same trend, because हमने अभी पढ़ा हुआ already कि जी identity Y जो है GDP is made up of C, और C major portion होता है. Similarly, this is the same graph previous वाला but zoomed out. Whenever GDP starts to fall, investment falls at a faster rate. People start leaving very quickly. For example, at the moment, since GDP growth rates are going down, and we know कि recession आया हुआ है economies के अंदर, global recession आया हुआ है, so people are very hesitant about investing their money in anywhere. So investment growth has gone down a lot. People have stopped investing. Similarly, what this graph over here, there are a couple of graphs. We can look at them in your own time and try to interpret what they're saying. This graph is saying that during periods decreasing growth, which are these bars, you'll find that unemployment starts to increase. So so if I just use my cursor over here, unemployment is increasing, it's increasing over here as well, it's increasing over here as well. These are all cases where your GDP was falling. Then the slide goes on to talk about the fact that in macroeconomics we'll have time frames, we'll have the long run and the short run. And the short run is where prices are going to be sticky, whereas the long run prices can change, they're flexible. And it says that economies behave differently in the short run and the long run because of the fact that in the short run prices are sticky. The next couple of slides talk about how we come up with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. downwards. The reason for why the aggregate demand is downward sloping, it talks about the theory of quantity of money. Then what causes the aggregate demand to shift? We said money supply or money in people's pockets causes the aggregate demand to shift. Then it talks about the long run aggregate supply curve, where it says that this is derived from the classical economics, where production or GDP in economy is basically a function of your factors of production over here, capital and labor. And when you're utilizing all your labor and capital and resources, you can produce a maximum amount of GDP. That's your natural level of output. And at this natural level of output, you are running at full employment levels. However, this full employment does not mean that everybody is employed, because in economies normally people keep changing jobs. So you will always find a certain percentage of people unemployed looking for jobs, because people who are looking for jobs are also classified as unemployed. And even people who are changing jobs are classified as unemployed. Then the slide goes on to show you this longer run aggregate supply curve, and changes in these factors of production will cause this supply curve to shift. And it's a vertical line. This graph talks about what happens in an economy when money gets printed in the economy. Whenever money gets printed in the economy, or if money supply is increased by the central bank, aggregate demand increases from 81 to 82. Whenever aggregate demand increases, in the long run, this the GDP increases, the price levels increase from P1 to P2. This is just depicting the idea that we've already talked about regarding how printing money or increasing money in people's pockets causes inflation in the long run, because goods are limited, and when there are too few goods being chased by too much money, the price of these goods go up. Then there is some information regarding why the short-run aggregate supply curve is horizontal based on sticky prices. And then this slide over here talks about what happens when money is printed in the short run. We've already discussed this in the whiteboard. Whenever money gets printed, aggregate demand increases. Aggregate demand increases causes the GDP to increase. This is the example of when the economy starts to overheat. GDP starts to increase in the short run because you might be crossing your natural level of output. I guess you need to read these slides on your own. And in the next class that we have, it's going to be a 1-hour session. I will quiz you on things that are over here, and then we'll assess how much you figured out, how much you don't understand. This slide over here is just talking about what happens when you try to overheat the economy. Whenever a government or shock causes the GDP of a country to increase beyond its natural output in the short run, this is a positive demand shock. In the long run, what happens is that prices start to increase. Any shock that causes the GDP to fall below the natural level of output in the short run causes the prices to fall in the long run. So if you go back to this thing over here that we drew earlier, so this shock over here, a negative demand shock, caused the GDP to fall below the natural output. So GDP was less than your natural output. In the short run, GDP was less than your natural output, which caused prices to fall in the long run. That's what the slide is basically saying. The slide is saying that, sorry, what's this? Oops, not this either. Where did it go? Sorry, let me just open the slides again. I don't know. Sorry. We're back. Not. Right. So if your short run GDP is and your maximum potential, this is where you're overheating the economy. Overheating the economy will cause prices to increase over time in the long run. If your GDP in the short run is less than your maximum, over time in the long run prices are going to fall. And if your GDP is equal to your natural output, GDP prices are going to remain the same in the long run. Let's see what these graphs are saying. This is what happens to the economy in the short and long run when money supply changes. This could be a positive demand shock. We discussed the case of PayPal or maybe Amazon coming to the economy, or the government deciding to issue, or maybe the government allowing students to actually get credit cards in Pakistan. Aggregate demand increases in the short run, price levels remain the same. In the long run, what starts to happen is price levels increase. So this is where money supply is controlled by the bank, by the central bank. The next couple of slides talk about shocks. Shocks are exogenous changes to the demand or supply that push the economy away from the long run equilibrium or full employment levels. Negative demand shock causes the short run aggregate supply demand causes the aggregate demand curve to move back. Economy moves from point A to point B, GDP falls. When GDP falls, unemployment increases, but price levels are constant in the short run. In the long run, economy starts to move towards point C, and at point C, what's happening is that price levels go down. Over time, prices fall and the economy moves down its demand curve towards full employment again. This is a negative demand shock. Then we have supply shocks. Supply shocks are where any shock that affects the production costs and causes the firms to change their price. And that's why they're called price shocks as well. Examples of price shocks, we discussed oil. This slide talks about bad weather causing crops yield to get destroyed, pushing up for food prices, things becoming expensive, which is causing the short run aggregate supply curve to move up. Second example is about workers unionizing. Whenever workers unionize and negotiate a wage raise, what happens is this wage raise gets passed on to the customer. If Beria University's employees unionize and demand their pays being doubled, the university will have no problem doing that. All it'll do is it'll transfer that increase in wages to the students. Unki fee बढ़ जाएगी. Similarly, using stuff like catalytic converters, new environmental regulations will cause end user के लिए prices to go up. When this happens, it should cause price levels of everything in the economy to go up. These are negative shocks. Positive supply shocks or favorable supply shocks are those that will lower cost. This case study is about what happened in 1970s. What happened in the 1970s was that these countries that were exporting oil to the rest of the world started to control the supply of oil to the world. And every year oil prices were increasing by 11, 68 and 60%, 16%. And this rise in prices of oil caused your short-run aggregate supply curve to move up. And when your short-run aggregate supply curve moved up, this is what happened. This is called the negative supply shock we discussed earlier. And this is a bad scenario because besides the fact that people start losing jobs because of decreasing GDP, price levels start going up as well. And in this case, going back from point B to point A might take a long time. So that is where government's central bank needs to come and intervene into the economy. So this case study you can go through on your own. It'll tell you some information of what happened to the economies when these oil shocks happened. Stabilization policy we've already discussed. These are policies that try to reduce the impact of these shocks or fluctuations that are happening in the economy. And normally, the monetary policy by the State Bank of Pakistan is used to reduce these shocks. We've discussed this case, I think. So, in order to reduce this adverse shock, the economy being at point B, money supply is increased, aggregate demand moves forward, and the economy is stabilized at point C. People get their jobs back, but prices are now permanently higher. That's probably the end of the chapter, G. Next time we will have a quiz on this and the multiplier. And come prepared for the quiz in the next class. We will
Kal, sir?
start, ma'am, Kal. We will be discussing consumption theory as well in tomorrow's class as well. That's going to be the last topic that we want to discuss before the end of before the mids. I guess that's probably it for the day then.
Sir, on campus,
Sorry?
mids on campus.
Yeah, I am. There is a lot of resistance coming from the students. Let me just